Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hi, and thanks, Don. Welcome, everyone, to our continuing Town Hall series on Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. My guest today is Chris Hughes, as well as Wade Forbes, who's going to be drawing the proceedings here today. I do want to mention to the audience that we're recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is primarily on organizations that are seeking certification under CMMC, and that's who we have mostly in our audience today. Audience members, please send in any questions that you have during the session in the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll try to work those in. I'll start with introduction of my guest, Chris Hughes. Chris specializes in cloud security architecture. He is co-founder and CISO of a new company named Aquia. Did I say that right, Chris? Is that?
Aquia, sorry.
Aquia. Okay. Extra pronunciation I didn't get right. Previously working as a principal security engineer at DevSecOps Innovator Rise 8. He's also an adjunct professor teaching courses on cloud security and is on the advisory boards of cyber resilience firm Accurix and audit management vendor BiteCheck. Previously worked for the federal government with FedRAMP JAB, the Navy, the Air Force. Chris, thanks for joining us today. You've got a really strong practitioner background. You've advised a lot of people on their cloud security strategy. Today, really hoping we can explore the role of cloud computing and specifically the role of infrastructure as code concepts as they play in our goal to meet CMMC requirements, get the most security and compliance benefits from the cloud services we're consuming. Thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely, I'm happy to be here.
So Chris, as we've watched and participated in CMMC as it's unfolded, one thing that's been dominant is that it's driving a lot of IT transformation and cloud adoption. I think people are finding out that just overlaying security practices onto their existing IT footprint isn't always workable or the best solution. Just want to get your take on why is the cloud such an important part of CMMC for most of us?
Yeah, I think the cloud is definitely an incredibly important topic for CMMC, is, for a variety of reasons too. Organizations of all shapes and sizes are basically increasing, their adoption of cloud as part of their overall IT and business strategy. And, large organizations are adopting it to maximize the use of emerging technologies like AI and ML, artificial intelligence and machine learning, for security and other purposes, data analytics and things like that. But SMBs are also taking advantage of cloud, to use managed services, especially in cases where they don't have, core competencies around some of the things they're consuming, right? So they're leaning into the CSP, the cloud service provider, to make up some of those gaps. That said, there's also a lot of misperception on the topic of cloud and whether or not they're secure. I know this is something we're going to get into a bit more, but the reality is that cloud, within government is basically assessed by independent third parties against the same control, security control baselines that government systems are. Take FedRAMP, for example, or DoD, using NIST 853. These are the same security control baselines that are used within DoD and, within the federal civilian community. And that said, the overwhelming majority of cloud data breaches actually occur on the customer side of the shared responsibility model, which is another topic I know we're definitely going to dive into as well. So I think it's just a matter of, customers understanding the shared responsibility model and, how that dictates like what the cloud service provider handles and what they as a cloud consumer are responsible for. And it's something that's misunderstood by so many, but it's such a fundamental topic. And I know we're going to unpack that a bit. But circling back to CMMC piece, I think cloud is an important part of CMMC because it's being utilized by many DIB vendors across the entire ecosystem, both large, prime companies, small SMB, subcontractors, et cetera. And not just one CSP either. They're using many, as a service type offerings, whether it's, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and definitely software as a service, a myriad of those basically. And those vendors are seeking CMMC certifications. So they need to ensure that the services they're using, based on DFARS and things like that, comply with FedRAMP moderate, for example, or equivalent standards. And that they understand that, what controls are met by the CSP, what controls are left to them as a cloud consumer, and then what controls are shared between those parties. So I think it's not only that, but it's also a topic that really, cloud needs to be understood by other parties in the mix too. We have 3 PAOs, right, who are going to assess, systems seeking certification. And then we also have RPs, registered practitioners who may be helping you prepare for a certification. All these parties basically need to have a solid understanding of cloud going into this, into the CMMC situation, so they can all perform their roles appropriately.
So as you point out, the cloud providers, by and large, doing a good job of security, and it's a great way to shift some of the compliance burden over to those CSPs. But I think many people underestimate what's left for them to do in that shared responsibility model. Specifically, I've seen some reports of really large, kind of scary numbers of cloud-based servers out there that are vulnerable, and primarily because it was misconfigured. I think that sometimes gets lumped back on the cloud service provider, but it's really on the consumer who set that up and made those choices. Typically, they're self-managing the cloud environment, and they may not have strong security expertise in-house. So tell us a little bit about infrastructure as code, those techniques, how they can help improve the security of cloud deployments, specifically for those kind of companies that may not have the extensive sort of infrastructure management expertise, and maybe that's why they reached to the cloud in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. You're spot on with a lot of the things you mentioned. As I previously mentioned, there's a lot of benefit of shifting some of that responsibility to, the CSP, right? And inheriting some controls in that shared responsibility model, especially areas that are outside of your core competencies. This is really true in particular for SMBs. They don't have robust, cybersecurity and IT staff, and they definitely, in a lot of cases, don't have staff with, skills around DevOps and infrastructure as code and things like that. And part of this is, also due to the fact that, as organizations increasingly adopt and migrate to cloud, security, unfortunately, is an afterthought, if it's even a thought at all, and that's always traditionally been the case with security. In many cases, it's typically bolted on versus baked in, as we've heard, so many times. So I think organizations in some cases don't invest in like upskilling their workforce or hiring necessary skill sets, or even partnering with, MSPs or other organizations that have the skills to help them through a secure cloud migration and adoption journey. On the infrastructure as code front, I can definitely help on this front for a number of reasons. Some of these benefits include like expediting the migration to cloud environments, right? If you start with utilizing pre-existing templates from cloud service providers or others, they can help you quickly get spun up into those environments, quickly provision the architecture that you need to utilize these cloud services. And they're aligned often with, the compliance frameworks such as NIST 853 and 800-171 and CMMC, that you need to comply with as an organization. On the infrastructure as code front, you have, vendor offerings, from like AWS and Azure. And AWS, you have AWS CloudFormation, for example, which is their native infrastructure as code format. Azure has what they call, blueprints, which is the same thing, but from Azure, it lets you use infrastructure as code to quickly spin up infrastructure in the cloud environment. And then there's, of course, the leading vendor agnostic approach, which works across multiple cloud service providers, which is Terraform, for example. So all these help, in the case that they're already aligned with the compliance frameworks that you're seeking to use, and it helps speed up that activity, especially if you don't have the expertise on how to quickly and securely, most importantly, set up cloud environments. As you mentioned, the overwhelming majority of cloud incidents and data breaches in the cloud are due to customer misconfiguration. So if you can start with like pre-existing templates of infrastructure as code that are secure, aligned with best practices, aligned with compliance frameworks, there's a tremendous benefit in that.
And just using an infrastructure as code template is not really a silver bullet in and of itself, right? Last year, Palo Alto Networks put out a study where they found like 200,000 vulnerabilities in the infrastructure as code templates that they looked at. So these are companies that are using IAC methods to roll out configurations quickly, so they're getting the speed benefits, but they're not taking care to properly harden those templates before you start using them in production. So now they end up, basically rapidly replicating poor security. So you mentioned vendor templates and be able to get a template from a trusted source that's aligned with the compliance. What else besides that should companies do to make sure that, the infrastructure as code methods that they're using are helping, not hurting?
Yeah, I definitely want to unpack this topic a bit. I'm familiar with the study that you cited. It's, by Unit 42, which is like Palo Alto's threat research group. There's also a similar study from an infrastructure as code industry leader called Bridge Crew, ironically enough, who was recently acquired by Palo Alto as well. But they basically went out and found, as you said, thousands of insecure infrastructure as code templates that were publicly available and had millions of downloads. So, think about that across all the enterprises, that are using infrastructure as code and cloud native architecture. You have millions of downloads of insecure configurations that have been pulled from these repositories.
Shop, is it?
Exactly right. You don't know what you're getting, and that's why it's very important to vet these, just like you would any other code that you bring into your enterprise or your environment, essentially your compute environment. So, while infrastructure as code offers tremendous benefits like version control, reuse, portability, scalability, as you said, it also helps you quickly provision infrastructure, and in many cases do so insecurely at scale very rapidly.
Not a good thing.
Yeah, which is very dangerous. Exactly. So if these infrastructure as code templates contain misconfigurations or vulnerable configurations, all you've done is replicated those misconfigurations and vulnerabilities at scale across your enterprise, which is very dangerous and leaves your organization at risk. The way that you would basically try to approach this and mitigate some of that risk is you want to introduce, security rigor and governance into your use of infrastructure as code templates. Since infrastructure as code is similar to other approaches of coding, you can use similar means to do this. There's open source tooling, and there's also vendor offerings that help on this front. Infrastructure as code security tools that can be used throughout the infrastructure as code lifecycle, essentially. Some of the popular open source ones, if you're using CloudFormation, are things such as CFN Lint, as it's called, to help you lint or vet, AWS CloudFormation templates for, misconfigurations or vulnerable configurations or deviations from best practices. And there's also open source options like Checkov and TerraScan that, they can scan, AWS CloudFormation, Azure Blueprints. They can scan, Terraform templates, for example. Some of the ones I've talked about, there's definitely some other options out there too. Those are three of the leading ones. So if you're working with Terraform, for example, those are good options to check out. And what these help you do is they help you scan these infrastructure as code templates, throughout its lifecycle, from the integrated development environment, from the time someone's writing that infrastructure as code template and being written, to where it gets pushed through maybe a CI/CD pipeline, and you have a webhook or something in place to scan that and look for vulnerabilities or misconfigurations or compliance deviations as it's going through a pipeline, for example. And then you also can scan repositories. If you have infrastructure as code templates and repositories, you can scan them there. And then also in production environments, scanning them there as well, and scanning your production environments for concerns. So it's important to scan these infrastructure as code templates, even after, say you're using a CI/CD pipeline, for example, and you've scanned it as part of pushing it through a pipeline. Some of the, these vendor offering and these tools that we've talked about, maybe you push it through a pipeline and that was 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, et cetera, ago. Maybe new checks have come out from these tools and you didn't catch them the first time, right? So you want to be continuously scanning these in repositories and in runtime environments to find, new deviations or insecure configurations if they exist. And some of these tools, like I mentioned, TerraScan and Checkov, for example, they have over 1,500 checks across 10 control frameworks. NIST, HIPAA, HITRUST. They have, checks against 80171. Undoubtedly, we'll be seeing checks integrated and built, for CMMC, for example, as it continues to materialize and mature, within the industry as well.
So that same study that I mentioned before, they showed a large number of environments had things like database encryption turned off, logging not enabled. So how does that interact with what we've just been talking about? Like if the scanners you mentioned would be, looking for more than just sort of the technical vulnerabilities that like a Nessus scan might find, but also finding those kind of hardening items, correct? Like things set in a way that may not be the most secure.
Yeah. I mean, whether it's like a deviation from a compliance requirement, which often could be the case, or an insecure configuration that just deviates from a best practice from a security perspective. Building on the tools that I mentioned previously, you can take this approach and these tools and approach it from a number of angles. The first one I mentioned was starting with a secure IAC template, maybe provided by the CSP. But of course, buyer beware there. You want to still, implement some rigor yourself. But, starting with those hard and secure, infrastructure as code templates, ideally in the first place, and then you can scan them, using the tooling I talked about to look for deviations, from compliance or security best practices. And it looks for things exactly like you mentioned, like a lack of database encryption, unrotated passwords, insecure, insufficient password policies, all kinds of things you can think about. Like I mentioned, over 1,500 checks is some of these tools have, for example, and it's looking for these, and it's like trying to help you ensure that these IAC templates that you're using, you're securely provisioning infrastructure and your cloud workloads and your cloud environments, not putting your organization at risk, basically.
So you mentioned some things the vendors are doing around, providing some templates that might be used, providing some tools. beyond that shared responsibility matrix where they basically say, hey, this is on you to make smart choices here. What else do you think the cloud vendors should be doing to really help people to make it easier to consume their services, if you will, right? To, secure compliant configurations. It seems today, if you're consuming these, even from the major vendors, it's pretty hard to get it right. And it's pretty hard to have confidence you've gotten it right. I mean, you've described a fairly complex process of shopping for templates, scanning those templates, managing those. That's a level of expertise a lot of companies may not have readily available. So and it's great advice, but do you think the vendors should be doing more there?
Yeah, this is definitely a topic that comes up, quite often in the community. Every time there's a cloud data breach or a leak, it's like, where's the cloud provider? And there's definitely some warranted, conversation in a lot of cases. I will say cloud providers have done a lot of work, on trying to educate customers on secure best practices, secure configurations and methods of using their platform. But on the other hand, we see, we still continue to see these rampant cloud data breaches and leaks due to customer misconfigurations in many cases, and a lack of understanding on the customer's part. So and on one hand, it comes back to, of course, educating and understanding you're part of the shared responsibility model, but there is a part to play from the cloud service provider. Some of these things can include integrating and rolling out services in a secure fashion initially. That way, the customer doesn't have a chance to insecurely just out the gate implement something, right? Another way I see CSPs helping is to continue to evangelize these security best practices and offering, free security training or free content and education around some of these security best practices to cloud customers. And that way they can help bridge that gap. There are some people on the other hand, and this is something I wanted to bring up, that many have called for more of an interventionist type approach, like where the cloud service provider may be identifying and notifying customers of insecure configurations within their environments or in their workloads, or in some cases, even blocking access entirely, right? If they identify an insecure configuration has been discovered. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of that approach because they don't necessarily have context into your business operations, what you're trying to accomplish, and it can cause, business interruption, right? So where do you draw a line on that front? And also, the responsibility essentially must end somewhere on the cloud service provider's part and start, with a cloud consumer. You have to have some responsibility of the services you're using. And then I also said, many CSPs, like the leading 3 CSPs of AWS, Google, and Microsoft Azure, for example, they do have some protections in place, things such as widespread DDoS, protection and things like that. So it's definitely an area that has a lot of conversation and opportunity to improve, but I think it's going to take an effort on both part, the cloud service provider and the cloud customer, to be honest.
I think there's some variations on that interventionist approach. I mean, my car has a seatbelt, but it also has a light that goes off and a beeper that goes off. It makes it very difficult for me to drive my car with the seatbelt off. So even if I want to, right, it's going to be intensely annoying, and I have to, break out the tools and modify my vehicle if I want to make that thing go away. So it's very, very challenging to do it in an unsafe way, right? And I think, that could be a possibility, maybe not for all computing, but if you say, hey, I'm going to be in the government community cloud and I'm going to be doing this in a compliant way, idiot light might not be a bad idea.
Right. Yeah. I mean, maybe there's some rudimentary configurations, like you simply cannot put this here unencrypted kind of thing, and you're going to get multiple notifications, or it might not be an option to do in some cases. Trying to put these protections in place to mitigate some of the impact on customers who just don't know any better in a lot of cases.
Right. And, if I'm off-roading and I want to buy a dune buggy, I can go do that. So in other words, if you think about it in the cloud sense, if you're buying in the government community cloud, the intention is you're going to be doing secure computing. If you need to do something insecure because you're selling chocolate chip cookie recipes, then, and you want to do so in an insecure manner, then feel free, buy something that's designed for that use case. So the other parties in the equation, I think, beyond some of the resources you mentioned, the vendors, is the MSPs, right? So at NeoSystems, we're doing a lot of automation work around cloud hardening, configuration management, and our intention is for our clients to be able to inherit that, from us, in that we're managing these environments on their behalf. How do you see the role of MSPs that operate with the cloud service providers to bring those infrastructure as code tools and practices to the table?
Yeah, I most definitely see, managed service providers, security service providers, cybersecurity service providers playing a huge role in the market for the exact reasons that you've laid out. Many vendors, for example, they want to utilize cloud for many of the benefits that we've discussed previously, but they may lack cloud and cloud security expertise. And maybe it's not their core competency, right? So by leveraging an MSP, they're able to get assistance, with secure provisioning, monitoring, and maybe even inherit some additional controls beyond what's provided from the CSP, for example. So DIB vendors can partner with MSPs such as NeoSystems to do these sort of activities that aren't part of their core competencies, and have trusted partners that have expertise across many customers pursuing similar goals, like CMMC certification, for example. And that helps bring efficiencies in cost, security, time to the DIB vendors that make use of MSPs such as NeoSystems and others, basically. So I think the real key here is going to come down to organizations realizing what is and isn't part of their area of expertise, and where they can afford to seek out partners like an MSP, for example, and instead focus on their core competencies as a business, which is often not provisioning and securing and monitoring systems and infrastructure, for example. That may not be their core competency, the reason they exist as a business. So these activities from the MSP basically expand on some of the things that we talked about, from infrastructure as code provisioning, even beyond that to other areas like continuous monitoring, security operations centers, incident response, beyond that, and even more.
Yeah, I was going to kind of go down that path, like beyond, we think of infrastructure as code in terms of the initial deployment, but CMMC has configuration management. So it's not just hardening at the time of deployment, but also ongoing management of changes. So that, like, continuous configuration automation, CCA tools, is that the right answer? And is that all part of the infrastructure as a code concept?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's actually one of the primary benefits from a security perspective around infrastructure as code is, since you're provisioning things from a code perspective, you have versioning, like you have source control, right? If something has changed, you can identify when it changed, how it changed, who changed it, what the change was, and then even revert back to, that known good, known compliant, secure state that you may have had with your infrastructure as code to begin with. So that's definitely a piece of it. And then leveraging, cloud capabilities as well as MSP capabilities in many cases, you can have that ongoing monitoring and visibility into your systems, your infrastructure, your workloads, to identify deviations or things that maybe even an incident that's starting to occur, and be able to address that much quicker than you could traditionally with manually provisioning infrastructure and managing it in that way, essentially.
I want to circle back on the incident response, but first I want to ask a question about maybe less traditional cloud workloads. So we think about cloud workloads, servers, setting up servers, network storage, but not all the IT departments that we're working with are developing custom apps. Many of them are just consuming SaaS essentially. So the big productivity suites from Microsoft, Google can cover most of their computing needs for a smaller DIB company. But these all-in-one suites still have a huge number of configuration settings and a huge number of things you could do that could cause it to be not very secure. Hardening Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace, that's not an easy task. Is what's your thinking on the role of infrastructure as code methods and tools there to manage those, either on a one-off basis or at scale?
Yeah, I think there's definitely room for utilizing that. And, many people look at the shared responsibility model, and I've been doing cloud for, many years at this point, look at the shared responsibility model and see SaaS, and they think, oh, wow, the cloud provider is doing almost everything. But you still own the data, right? And you still own the exposure of the data. And then not only that, but you can't outsource customer trust. Like you have your brand recognition, your brand, respect of your brand within the market. You can't outsource that to the cloud service provider, even in a SaaS type model. So if you're using Office suite tools, like you mentioned, like, Office 365 or Google Workspaces, you're still storing data. You still have access control for identities and things of that nature. So there's a lot of room for infrastructure as code to play a part. And then there's also a lot of room for that continuous, ongoing management and visibility. I know on the Azure front, for example, they have their Azure Security Center and Compliance Dashboard. This can look at things, including Office 365, and tell you, what insecure configurations are in place, what items of concern may exist for you as a consumer to go and take a look at, and it gives you visibility in a continuous fashion. So there's definitely a lot of room for play in that area.
Yeah, I think most people look at that dashboard might be surprised how much is still in their court, right? That's not taken care of by the vendor, either automatically behind the scenes or as a default setting. So you mentioned about incident response, and I want to dive on that for a minute. We've seen some state-sponsored threat actors. These are big, sophisticated, coordinated attacks. One of the big challenges after SolarWinds, for example, was thousands of companies all trying to determine their status. Are they compromised? Are they not compromised? This was stretching. I mean, some companies have those skills in-house, ready to go. Some have a retainer with an incident response company, but for many, this is the first time that they're trying to make that kind of a decision. Did the threat actor actually enter my system or not? It's not an easy question to answer. How do you see infrastructure as code methods helping with that sort of determination of, knowing when you've got a problem and then having a path to fix it?
I think it definitely plays a part in the sense that you can go and look at, your infrastructure as code templates and your source code, beyond infrastructure as code, and see what is configured and put into your environment. And then another area I think is definitely worth calling out on this front that we're seeing a lot of traction now is software bill of materials, or SBOM, as you may have heard it called. And that's letting you know, what exactly do you have in your environment? What libraries, what third-party dependencies, and then tracing that, because a part of the issue is if you don't know what you have, you don't know what you're impacted by. So you need an accurate inventory of what, not just obviously hardware and legacy on-premise environments, but what software is in our environment, what libraries are part of our environment. So all those things are definitely a consideration as part of the conversation, to get an idea of what do we have and are we impacted.
That was, I can't cite the source off the top of my head, but I remember hearing somebody talk about after SolarWinds, just, do we have this software in a vulnerable version, was a tough question for many government agencies to answer, and I assume many contractors as well.
Yeah, I just want to throw a quick plug. Linux Foundation has an SBOM free training course. It's like a 2-hour course, and I highly advise any security professionals like myself and you and others who are interested, go check it out. It just gives you an idea of what is SBOM, how do you use an SBOM, and then exactly what you're talking about, why would this be relevant and valuable in an incident.
So last week we heard from Google on this series. They were talking about their assured workloads concept, where they use customer managed encryption keys to solve problems around data sovereignty, for example, right? ITAR data, making sure it doesn't go to any foreign countries. I'm curious about how this works at scale. Have you seen it? So infrastructure as a code concepts being extended to that sort of situation, key management, maybe we'll call it key management as code?
So I'll say my personal experience, I have not worked with this directly. I'm very familiar with encryption keys and key management within cloud environments, whether you want to use their native services, or you want to create keys in their environment that are FIPS 140 TAC 2 compliant, or even 140 TAC 3, and use hardware security modules, things of that case, or things of that nature, I'm sorry. Or even if you want to import keys yourself and have external ownership of keys for various compliance and security reasons. But I haven't seen encryption key utilization around infrastructure as code. But that said, I have no issue of admitting when it's outside of my area of experience, and I definitely look like something I can dig into more and learn more about, to be honest.
I haven't seen it either, but I thought I'd ask. It's one of those, when I was listening to Google representative talk about it, it occurs to me that having a handful of encryption keys is a fairly simple problem. But if you start tying those to large, complex stores of data, you may have a pretty large, complex store of keys on your key ring that you need to manage with some, potentially some automation, some configuration management. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. As we talked about, a lot of these companies, this security activity, these technology activities are not necessarily their core competencies. And the same thing goes for encryption key management, which is a really critical task and hard to do at scale, like you just said. So I would not be surprised to see, key management as a service to become very prevalent, basically.
And I think that assured workloads from Google has some of that built in, that she was kind of implying that. So I'm not expert on it enough to know. We've got just a couple minutes left. I was informed that my tendency to run over is going to cramp Chris's style. He's got a meeting right after this one. So we're going to try to wrap this up on time, which may shock those of you who are regular attendees to this session. So in closing, Chris, I want to ask you about how we can make smart choices regarding the cloud, right? So the choice of a cloud architecture, vendors to choose, what goes in the cloud, what stays on-prem, that kind of architectural choice is a very big fork in the road right at the start of the CMMC journey for most people. What's your advice to those who are stuck in analysis paralysis, looking at a complex marketplace with complex choices?
Being a very pro cloud on my end, I actually tend to encourage folks to lean into the cloud in many cases if they don't have extensive IT and cybersecurity expertise in particular, because of the shared responsibility model and being able to inherit controls from the CSP or an MSP, or CSP and MSP combination like we talked about. But also you want to look and approach this, ensure that you're using cloud services that have been vetted appropriately, that have FedRAMP certifications, or FedRAMP equivalent, as DFARS 7012 uses the language. That's a whole other topic. But you want to make sure that the services you're using are authorized and accredited. and approve, for government workloads. And that's an initial first step. And then also, if you don't have the core competencies of how to navigate cloud securely, how to provision and use cloud, definitely seeking out a partner, managed service provider, consulting, whatever the case is, some kind of partner to help you navigate this journey securely and ensure that you're not putting your organization at risk. And leveraging the cloud, I'm also a big proponent of the concept of a virtual enclave, right? Setting up like a secure virtual enclave where you keep the CUI type data, FCI, CUI type data, and you don't let it sprawl out and cross your entire on-premise infrastructure, for example. So you keep it in this environment, you implement these controls that are applicable here that can mitigate cost, because you're not trying to cover everything now that makes up your whole architecture, but you also mitigate some concern. You know exactly where that data is, who has access to it, how it's secured, those kind of things.
Chris, thank you very much. That's great advice. We are right at the bottom of the hour, so amazingly for me, I'm not a very good time manager, so glad we could bring that in on schedule. I appreciate your time, audience members. Appreciate your time and attention today, and I think there was some really good information that you're putting out. Again, this is something that is not required by CMMC, that you cloud adoption, et cetera, but it's ubiquitous in the decision making around CMMC compliance. So very important for people to think about this in the right way, and it definitely helps to make the journey less bumpy. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We have a break next week for the Independence Day celebration. We're going to take the week off, and we'll restart our CMMC Town Hall series on July 14th at 1 o'clock Eastern. Please head over to our website, neosystemscorp.com, if you need the registration details. If you're on our mailing list, you should see some promotions with a registration link in there. So thanks for your time and attention today.
Thank you.